Insomnia. Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government, by Christopher H. Achen and Larry M. Bartels. We're going to continue with Chapter 2, which is entitled The Elusive Mandate, Elections and the Mirage of Popular Control. And this section is called Public Opinion and Political Ideology. Zoller's allusion to the rationally ignorant median voter fused two distinct aspects of Downes' economic theory of democracy. One is the unidimensional spatial model of electoral competition, in which parties have strong incentives to converge on the ideological ideal point of the median voter. The other is Downes' analysis of political information costs, which led him to conclude that because of the infinitesimal role which each citizen's vote plays in deciding the election, the returns to acquiring political information are so low that many rational voters will refrain from purchasing any political information per se. Thus, a large percentage of citizens, including voters, do not become informed to any significant degree on the issues involved in elections, even if they believe the outcomes to be important. Unfortunately for the spatial model of electoral competition to work, rationally ignorant voters do need some political information. In particular, if they are to succeed in voting for the party closest to them, they need to know their own preferences and the platforms of the competing parties regarding the issues involved in elections. The voters' own preferences, especially, are often simply taken for granted in the populist theory of democracy. But what if voters don't really know what they want? In that case, the folk theory of democracy, and the spatial model in particular, loses its starting point. One telling indication that this foundation of the folk theory may be shakier than it appears is the fact that expressed political attitudes can be remarkably sensitive to seemingly innocuous variations in question wording or context. For example, 63% to 65% of Americans in the mid-1980s said that the federal government was spending too little on assistance to the poor, but only 20 to 25% said that it was spending too little on welfare. Welfare clearly had deeply negative connotations for many Americans, probably because it stimulated rather different mental images than assistance to the poor. Would additional federal spending in this domain have reflected the will of the majority or not? We can suggest no sensible way to answer that question. It seems tendentious to insist that welfare and assistance to the poor denoted different policies, and that Americans carefully opposed the former while supporting the latter. However, even if that distinction is accepted, qualitatively similar framing effects appear in cases where the substantive distinction between alternative frames is even more tenuous. For example, in 3 separate experiments conducted in the mid-1970s, almost half of Americans said they would not allow a communist to give a speech, while only about 1/4 said they would forbid him or her from doing so. In the weeks leading up to the 1991 Gulf War, almost 2/3 of Americans were willing to use military force, but fewer than half were willing to engage in combat, and fewer than 30% were willing to go to war. Framing more abstract quantitative choices in different but mathematically equivalent ways also produces predictable, and sometimes dramatic, differences in results. The psychological indeterminacy of preferences revealed by these framing effects and question wording experiments calls into question the most fundamental assumption of populist democratic theory, that citizens have definite preferences to be elicited and aggregated through some well-specified process of collective choice. In this respect, modern cognitive psychology has sharpened and reinforced concerns about the quality of public opinion raised by critics of democracy, from Plato to the pioneering survey researchers of the 1940s and 1950s. The first rigorous scientific portrait of the American voter, by Bernard Berelson and his colleagues at Columbia University, found that the voter falls short of displaying the motivation, knowledge, and rationality expected by traditional normative theory. On the issues of the campaign, the Columbia scholars found there is a considerable amount of don't know, sometimes reflecting genuine indecision, more often meaning don't care. Voters consistently misperceived where candidates stood on the important issues of the day and exaggerated the extent of public support for their favorite candidates. And vote choices were relatively invulnerable to direct argumentation and characterized more by faith than by conviction and by wishful expectation rather than careful prediction of consequences. Several years later, in a landmark study of the American voter, Angus Campbell and his colleagues at the University of Michigan described the general impoverishment of political thought in a large proportion of the electorate. They acknowledged that many people know the existence of few, if any, of the major issues of policy, much less how the competing parties and candidates might address them. Shifts in election outcomes, they concluded, were largely attributable to defections from long-standing partisan loyalties by relatively unsophisticated voters with little grasp of issues or ideology. Philip Converse's essay on the nature of belief systems and mass publics provided an even more devastating and influential portrait of the political thinking of ordinary citizens. Employing the growing store of data collected by the Michigan Survey Research Center, Converse concluded that many citizens do not have meaningful beliefs, even on issues that have formed the basis for intense political controversy among elites for substantial periods of time. Converse's evidence was of three kinds. First, he scrutinized respondents' answers to open-ended questions about political parties and candidates for evidence that they understood and spontaneously employed the ideological concepts at the core of elite political discourse. He found that about 3% of voters were clearly classifiable as ideologues, with another 12% qualifying as near ideologues. The vast majority of voters, and an even larger proportion of non-voters, seem to think about parties and candidates in terms of group interests or the nature of the times, or in ways that conveyed no shred of policy significance whatever. Second, Converse assessed the degree of organization of political belief systems, as measured by statistical correlations between responses to related policy questions. Could respondents give consistently liberal or consistently conservative responses? He found only modest correlations, averaging just 0.23, among domestic policy views regarding employment, aid to education, and federal housing. Similarly modest correlations among foreign policy views regarding foreign economic aid, soldiers abroad, and isolationism, and virtually no correlation between views across these two domains. Nor were specific policy views strongly correlated with party preferences, averaging just 0.07. In each case, the corresponding correlations were much higher for a sample of congressional candidates responding to related but more specific policy questions. Converse interpreted these results as providing strong support for the hypothesis that constraint among political idea elements begins to lose its range very rapidly once we move from the most sophisticated few toward the grassroots. Converse himself recognized that constraint among political idea elements, especially across issue domains, was primarily a matter of social learning rather than logical reasoning. Critics of the time and since have pointed out that there may be nothing particularly sophisticated about parroting the specific combination of issue positions defining a conventional ideology or party line. Perhaps ordinary citizens' issue preferences lacked constraint because they had thoughtfully constructed their own personal political belief system transcending conventional ideologies and party lines. Alas, this argument ran around on Converse's third set of analyses, which assessed the stability of their attitudes regarding specific issues. Converse gauged the stability of belief elements by tracking the same people's responses to the same questions across 3 separate interviews conducted at 2-year intervals between 1956 and 1960. Successive responses to the same questions turned out to be remarkably inconsistent. The correlation coefficients measuring the temporal stability of responses for any given issue from one interview to the next ranged from a bit less than 0.5 down to a bit less than 0.3, suggesting that issue views are extremely labile for individuals over time. In marked contrast, expressions of party identification were much more stable, with correlations from one survey to the next exceeding 0.7. Converse inferred that parties are more central within the political belief systems of the mass public than are the policy ends that the parties are designed to pursue. Converse's essay set off a very substantial debate about his methodology and interpretations. Perhaps no single argument he advanced was fully persuasive, but even most critics agreed with his conclusion. The political belief systems of ordinary citizens bore little resemblance to the ideal embodied in the folk theory of democracy. As Kinder and Calmo summarized current scholarly understanding, genuine ideological identification and abiding dispositional commitment to an ideological point of view turns out to be rare. Real liberals and real conservatives are found in impressive numbers only in the higher echelons of political society, confined to the comparatively few who are deeply and seriously engaged in political life. For most ordinary citizens, ideology is, at best, a byproduct of more basic partisan and group loyalties. Thus, as Kinder and Calmo noted, Americans are much more resolute in their identification with party than they are in their identification with ideology. Research in other countries has generally produced similar portraits of democratic citizens. Their ideological self-placements are often driven more by partisanship than by policy positions. Indeed, left-right terms are sometimes meaningful primarily as alternate names for the political parties, often names that the parties themselves have taught the voters. Even in France, the presumed home of ideological politics, Converse and Pierce found that most voters did not understand political left and right. When citizens do understand the terms, they may still be uncertain or confused about where the parties stand on the left-right dimension. Perhaps as a result, their partisan loyalties and issue preferences are often badly misaligned. In a 1968 survey in Italy, for example, 50% of those who identified with the right-wing monarchist party took left-wing policy positions. Lest younger readers be tempted to suppose that this sort of confusion is a remnant of an older and less sophisticated political era, or an artifact of older and less sophisticated scholarly analysis, we note that careful recent studies have repeatedly turned up similar findings. For example, Elizabeth Zeichmeister found striking systematic differences both within and across the countries in the conceptions of left and right offered by elite private college students in Mexico and Argentina. While André Blay, personal communication, found half of German voters unable to place the party called Die Linke, the left, on a left-right scale. This rather bleak portrait of public opinion has provoked a good deal of resistance among political scientists, and a variety of concerted attempts to overturn or evade the findings of the classic Columbia and Michigan studies. In the 1970s, for example, some scholars claim to have discovered the changing American voter, a much more issue-oriented and ideologically consistent specimen than the earlier studies had portrayed. Unfortunately, further scrutiny revealed that most of the apparent change could be attributed to changes in the questions voters were being asked, rather than to more elevated political thinking. When 1970s voters were asked the old questions, their responses displayed little more consistency or sophistication than they had in the 1950s. Other scholars have argued that overarching ideological convictions are unnecessary because citizens can derive meaningful policy preferences from somewhat narrower core values such as equal opportunity, limited government, or traditional morality. Citizens' allegiances or antipathies to these values do tend to be somewhat more stable than their specific policy preferences. However, they are a good deal less stable than the phrase core values would seem to imply, being significantly colored by party identification and even by short-term vote intentions. Since the 1980s, the American political system has seen a substantial increase in partisan polarization, with Democratic elites becoming more clearly and consistently liberal, and Republican elites more clearly and consistently conservative. As a result, rank-and-file partisans have increasingly come to adopt ideological labels consistent with their partisanship. Has this solved Converse's problem? Alas, voters' policy preferences seem to have become only modestly more ideological coherent as a result, with the average correlation between pairs of policy preferences increasing from a paltry 0.16 in 1972 to a slightly less paltry 0.2 in 2012. Not much has changed. Similarly, when a group of scholars half a century later painstakingly replicated many of the specific analyses presented in The American Voter, using survey data from 2000 and 2004, they found no change in most respects, and only glacial improvements in the remainder. Voters, it seems, are what they are, and not what idealistic proponents of popular sovereignty might wish them to be. The folk theory is of little use in understanding actual democratic politics. Thus, most contemporary scholars of public opinion have come to accept, at least in broad outline, Converse's portrait of democratic citizens. Kinder and Calmo conclude that Converse's conclusion of ideological innocence still stands. Educational transformation, party polarization, revolutionary changes in information dissemination, fundamental alterations in gender and race relations, impressive as these changes have been, equally impressive is how little visible effect they have had on how the American electorate understands politics. Let's see. The next section is called Political Ignorance, Heuristics, and the Miracle of Aggregation. Confusion regarding political ideology is just the tip of a large iceberg of political unawareness. Michael Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter surveyed responses to hundreds of specific factual questions in U.S. opinion surveys over the preceding 50 years to provide an authoritative summary of what Americans know about politics and why it matters. In 1952, Deli, Carpini, and Keeter found only 44% of Americans could name at least one branch of government. In 1972, only 22% knew something about Watergate. In 1985, only 59% knew whether their own state's governor was a Democrat or Republican. In 1986, only 49% knew which one nation in the world had used nuclear weapons. Deli, Carpini, and Keeter concluded from these and scores of similar findings that large numbers of American citizens are woefully underinformed and that overall levels of knowledge are modest at best. Robert Luskin put the same conclusion rather more colorfully, observing that most people know jaw-droppingly little about politics. Here too, it is striking how little seems to have changed in the decades since survey research began to shed systematic light on the nature of public opinion. Changes in the structure of the mass media have allowed people with an uncommon taste for public affairs to find an unprecedented quantity and variety of political news, but they have also allowed people with more typical tastes to abandon traditional newspapers and television news for round-the-clock sports, pet tricks, or pornography, producing an increase in the variance of political information levels, but no change in the average level of political information. Similarly, while formal education remains a strong predictor of individuals' knowledge about politics, substantial increases in American educational attainment have produced little apparent increase in overall levels of political knowledge. When Delhi, Carpini, and Keeter compared responses to scores of factual questions asked repeatedly in opinion surveys over the past half-century, they found that the public's level of political knowledge is little different today than it was 50 years ago. Given the ample reasons to expect changing levels of knowledge over the past 50 years, this finding provides the strongest evidence for the intractability of political knowledge and ignorance. Ilya Somin concluded from a more recent survey among similar lines that widespread political ignorance is a serious problem for democracy, and questioned whether the modern electorate even comes close to meeting the requirements of democratic theory. Some critics of this perspective have supposed that opinion surveys significantly underestimate people's political knowledge by providing insufficient motivation for them to answer questions correctly. Unfortunately, insufficient motivation is endemic to mass politics, not an artifact of opinion surveys. We do not doubt that voters would be better informed if they were paid to learn political facts, but that seems impractical, and judging by the results of these studies, extremely expensive. Others imagine that visual political knowledge, recognizing the faces of political figures but not their names, provides a different road to competence, but adding photographs to the ballot would raise significant additional problems of voter bias. Most attempts to redeem the electorate have taken a different tack, acknowledging that voters are generally inattentive and uninformed, but denying that the quality of their political decisions suffers much as a result. For example, formal theorists have proposed versions of the spatial model of elections in which the usual postulate that voters are fully informed is loosened somewhat. Unfortunately, even uninformed voters in these models know a great deal more than most real voters do. For example, one influential spatial model of elections with uninformed voters posited that all voters know the distribution of voters' ideal points. Informed voters know the candidates' positions exactly, and uninformed voters know the levels of informed support for candidates, from poll data, and the left-right order of the candidates' positions, from which they then proceed to infer the candidates' positions on the basis of spatial theory. Alas, as we have seen, most voters do not know what political left and right mean, much less know what informed voters think. Thus, few, if any, of these cheery assumptions are likely to hold in practice. In the early 1990s, a spate of books with such reassuring titles as The Reasoning Voter, Reasoning in Choice, and The Rational Public argued that voters could use information shortcuts or heuristics to make rational electoral choices, even though they lacked detailed knowledge about candidates and policies. These shortcuts could take a variety of forms, including cues from trusted individuals or groups, inferences derived from political or social stereotypes, or generalizations from personal experience or folk wisdom. Sociologists and political scientists have long recognized that citizens sometimes take cues from better-informed friends, relatives, neighbors, or coworkers. The writer Calvin Trillin once had such an arrangement. Mrs. Trillin, Alice, gave Cyprus to Mr. Trillin for his birthday. For the next 12 months she would think about Cyprus and he wouldn't have to. Mr. Trillin for Christmas gave Mrs. Trillin Iran. Neither of them was willing to take over thinking about the SALT disarmament talks. The very humor of the story points to one limitation of this defense of democracy. While Mr. and Mrs. Trillin were sufficiently well informed, and we hope politically compatible, to make such a division of labor feasible and efficient, most citizens don't have a Cyprus watcher in the house and would not know what to make of advice about Cyprus if they had it. The literature on heuristics in political science is an odd stepchild of the corresponding literature in psychology, Psychologists have devoted exhaustive attention to the biases in judgment produced by reliance on specific identifiable heuristics. For example, the classic collection of essays edited by Daniel Kahneman, Paul Slovic, and Amos Tversky included reports of belief in the law of small numbers, shortcomings in the attribution process, egocentric biases in availability and attribution, the illusion of control, and overconfidence in case study judgments, among other topics. It also included a series of essays on corrective procedures intended to mitigate the effects of these various biases and shortcomings. Political scientists, by comparison, have typically been much more likely to view heuristics as a boon to democracy. We suspect, along with James Kuklinski and Paul Quirk, that enthusiasm has much to do with the fact that the notion of a competent citizenry is normatively attractive. It buttresses efforts to expand citizen participation and credits the citizenry for some of American democracy's success. When students of political heuristics have defined the tasks of citizens sufficiently clearly for concrete performance benchmarks to be meaningful, they have tended to present those tasks in such highly simplified form that all of the difficulties of real political inference are abstracted away. More often, observed preferences and behavior are deemed rational simply because they look reasonable or seem to be influenced by plausibly relevant considerations. In one of the most colorful examples of a political information shortcut, Samuel Popkin argued that Mexican-American voters had good reason to be suspicious of President Gerald Ford when he made the mistake during a Texas primary campaign appearance of trying to down a tamale without first removing its corn husk wrapper. According to Popkin, showing familiarity with a voter's culture is an obvious and easy test of ability to relate to the problems and sensibilities of the ethnic group, and to understand and care about them. An obvious and easy test, yes. An accurate basis for inferring Ford's sensitivities towards Mexican Americans? We have no idea. Lacking any objective standard for distinguishing reliable political cues from unreliable ones, some scholars have simply asked whether uninformed citizens, using whatever information shortcuts are available to them, manage to mimic the preferences and choices of better informed people. Alas, statistical analysis of the impact of political information on policy preferences have produced ample evidence of substantial divergences between the preferences of relatively uninformed and better informed citizens. Similarly, when ordinary people are exposed to intensive political education and conversation on specific policy issues, they often change their mind. Parallel analyses of voting behavior have likewise found that uninformed citizens cast significantly different votes than those who were better informed. For example, Bartels estimated that actual vote choices fell about halfway between what they would have been if voters had been fully informed and what they would have been if everyone had picked candidates by flipping coins. Richard Lau and David Redlowsk analyzed the same elections using a less demanding criterion for assessing correct voting. They took each voter's partisanship, policy positions, and evaluations of candidate performance as given, setting aside the fact that these, too, may be subject to errors and biases. They found that about 70% of voters, on average, chose the candidate who best matched their own expressed preferences. Lau and Redlowsk wondered, is 70% correct enough? Answering that question requires a careful assessment of the extent to which incorrect voters skew election outcomes. Optimism about the competence of democratic electorates has often been bolstered, at least among political scientists, by appeals to what Converse dubbed the miracle of aggregation, an idea formed by the Marquis de Condorcet more than 200 years ago, and forcefully argued with empirical evidence by Benjamin Page and Robert Shapiro. Condorcet demonstrated mathematically that if several jurors made independent judgments of a suspect's guilt or innocence, a majority are quite likely to judge correctly, even if every individual juror is only modestly more likely than chance to reach the correct conclusion. Applied to electoral politics, Condorcet's logic suggests that the electorate as a whole may be much wiser than any individual voter. The crucial problem with this mathematically elegant argument is that it does not work very well in practice. Real voters' errors are quite unlikely to be statistically independent, as Condorcet's logic requires. When thousands or millions of voters misconstrue the same relevant fact or are swayed by the same vivid campaign ad, no amount of aggregation will produce the requisite miracle. Individual voters' errors will not cancel out in the overall election outcome, especially when they are based on constricted flows of information. If an incumbent government censors or distorts information regarding foreign policy or national security, the resulting errors in citizens' judgments obviously will not be random. Less obviously, even unintentional errors by politically neutral purveyors of information may significantly distort collective judgment, as when statistical agencies or the news media overstate or understate the strength of the economy in the run-up to an election. Bartels estimated how well the overall outcomes of 6 presidential elections matched what they would have been if every voter had been fully informed. The average discrepancy between the actual popular vote and the hypothetical fully informed outcome of each election amounted to 3 percentage points, more than enough to swing a close contest. Related analyses of voting behavior in Sweden, Canada, and many other countries have found similar effects of information on aggregate election outcomes. Thus, the lack of political knowledge matters, not only for individual voters, but also for entire electorates, the policies they favor, and the parties they elect. And that's all I'm going to read for now. We are not yet through Chapter 2, The Elusive Mandate. The next section is entitled The Illusion of Issue Voting. And hopefully in this next reading it will finish this chapter.